Does Julian know? Austin's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. His hands, rough from hours of work in the garden, brushed against mine as he reached for the glass of water I'd offered him. I froze, the weight of his question pressing down on me. The unspoken tension between us hung thick, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. No, I finally managed, my voice barely audible. He doesn't. It started innocently enough. Julian was away, as he often was, leaving me to wander through the empty halls of our home like a ghost. The days blurred together, the monotony of my life stretching out before me like an endless road. But then he arrived. Austin was only 21, a young gardener hired to tend to the overgrown mess Julian had long neglected. From the moment I first saw him, I couldn't look away. There was something about the way he moved, confident yet unassuming, his hands working the earth with a kind of reverence that made me pause. I found myself lingering by the window, watching him from behind the curtains, a flutter of something I hadn't felt in years stirring within me. It's nothing, I told myself. He's just a boy. But the more I watched, the harder it became to ignore the pull I felt. His laughter carried on the breeze, and I found myself smiling at the sound. His presence was like a breath of fresh air in the suffocating stillness of my life. The first time I spoke to him, it was on a whim. I'd been standing in the kitchen, staring out at him as he worked, when I decided to bring him a glass of water. My hands trembled as I approached, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. "You must be thirsty," I said, holding out the glass. He looked up at me, his sun-kissed face breaking into a warm smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Sophia." The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine. "Just Sophia," I replied, trying to steady my voice. We talked for a while, about the garden, the weather, nothing important. But every word he spoke made my heart race. There was an ease about him, a genuineness that I hadn't encountered in so long. When he laughed at something I said, I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling I hadn't realized I'd been missing. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and he packed up his tools, the guilt began to creep in. "What are you doing, Sophia?" "He's half your age. You're married." I stared at my reflection in the window later that night, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Julian called that evening, his voice distant as always. "How's everything at home?" he asked, the question perfunctory, almost robotic. "Fine," I replied, my voice flat. I wanted to tell him about Austin, about the way his presence made me feel alive again. But I couldn't. Instead, I listened as Julian rattled on about his business trip, his words fading into the background as my thoughts drifted back to the garden. The next day, I found myself lingering outside again, watching Austin as he worked. His shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat, and I felt a heat rise within me that I couldn't ignore. When he looked up and caught my eye, I didn't look away. "Need any help?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His eyes widened in surprise, but he nodded. "Sure, if you're offering." We worked side by side, our hands brushing occasionally as we tended to the flowers. Every touch sent a jolt through me, and I could feel the tension building between us. When our eyes met, I could see the same desire mirrored in his gaze. Days turned into weeks, and our encounters became more frequent. I'd find excuses to be outside when he was there, our conversations growing deeper, more intimate. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, the air thick with unspoken words, he turned to me. "Sophia," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I can't stop thinking about you." The admission hung in the air, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Austin," I trailed off, unsure of what to say. He reached for my hand, his touch sending a shiver through me. "I know this is complicated, but I can't keep pretending like I don't feel something." I wanted to pull away, to tell him this was wrong. But I couldn't. Instead, I leaned in, our lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It was a moment of pure, undeniable connection, and I felt myself falling deeper into something I couldn't control. But now, as we stood in the kitchen, the weight of his question pressing down on me, I felt the reality of what we were doing come crashing down. "Does Julian know?" The words echoed in my mind, and I could feel the guilt gnawing at me. But beneath it, there was something else, a flicker of defiance, a desire to hold on to this feeling for as long as I could. "No," I repeated, my voice steadier this time. "He doesn't." Austin's eyes searched mine, and I could see the conflict in his gaze. But before he could say anything, I reached for him, pulling him into a kiss that silenced any doubts. For now, that was enough. The days after that kiss stretched out like a taut wire, trembling with unspoken tension. I found myself lingering by the window more than ever, watching Austin work in the garden, his sun-kissed skin glistening in the afternoon light. My heart raced every time he looked up, as if he could sense my presence even from across the yard. But he didn't wave, didn't smile. There was a distance between us now, one I wasn't sure how to bridge. Julian had returned home the night after that kiss, and his presence felt heavier than usual. He was distracted, distant, his mind always somewhere else, on his business trips, his meetings, his endless to-do lists. He didn't notice the way I fidgeted at dinner, the way my eyes kept darting toward the garden, or the way my hands trembled when I reached for my glass of wine. He didn't notice me, but Austin did. One afternoon, when Julian was out at yet another meeting, I decided I couldn't keep pretending. I grabbed a glass of iced tea and stepped outside, the sun warm on my skin. Austin was kneeling by the rose bushes, his hands moving deftly as he trimmed the stems. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. "Hey," I said softly, holding out the glass. "I thought you might be thirsty." He hesitated for a moment before taking it, his fingers brushing against mine. A jolt of electricity shot through me, and I quickly pulled my hand away, though not fast enough to miss the way his eyes flicked up to meet mine. "Thanks," he said, his voice low and rough. He took a sip, his gaze never leaving mine, and I felt my cheeks heat under the intensity of it. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Austin," I started, but he cut me off. "Sophia, we can't keep doing this," he said, his voice strained. "It's not right." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I took a step back, my heart aching. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling, "but I can't help how I feel." Austin set the glass down on the ground and stood, towering over me. His eyes were dark, filled with a mixture of longing and frustration. "Do you even know what you want?" he asked, his voice sharp. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Because the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know if I wanted to throw caution to the wind and risk everything for this connection, or if I wanted to stay in the safety of my marriage, even if it left me feeling empty. Austin let out a frustrated sigh and ran a hand through his hair. "I can't keep pretending this isn't affecting me," he said, his voice softer now. "Every time I see you, I want." He trailed off, his eyes dropping to my lips. My breath hitched, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body. "You," he said simply, his voice raw with emotion. "I want you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt myself leaning in, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. But before our lips could meet, he pulled back, shaking his head. "We can't," he said, stepping away from me. "Not like this. Not while you're still, while he's still." He didn't finish the sentence. But he didn't need to. I knew what he meant, and the guilt I'd been trying to suppress came rushing back, threatening to drown me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Austin's expression softened, and he reached out to brush a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it only made the ache in my chest grow stronger. "Don't be," he said, his voice barely audible. I need to know that you're sure, that this is what you really want." I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Was I sure? Did I really want to risk everything for this connection, for this man who made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years? Before I could answer, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made us both freeze. Julian was home. Austin stepped back, his expression hardening. "I should go," he said, his voice strained. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart in pieces. As Julian stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, I wiped the tears from my eyes and forced a smile. But inside, I was screaming. Screaming for the connection I'd felt with Austin, the connection I wasn't sure I could let go of. But for now, I had to pretend. Pretend that everything was fine. Pretend that my heart wasn't breaking. Pretend that I wasn't drowning in a sea of guilt and desire. And as Julian walked through the door, oblivious to the storm raging inside me, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever find my way back to the surface. The sound of Julian's suitcase rolling across the hardwood floor felt like a nail being hammered into my chest. He's back. I took a deep breath, painting on the smile that had become my second skin. How was the trip? I asked, my voice steady, though my hands trembled slightly. Exhausting, he replied, barely glancing at me as he loosened his tie. I'll be in the study. I have a few calls to make. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing in the foyer, the weight of his indifference pressing down on me. Is this all there is? I thought, my mind drifting to Austin, to the way his eyes had lingered on mine, to the warmth of his touch, to the honesty in his words. I wandered into the kitchen, my fingers tracing the edge of the counter as my gaze drifted to the window. The garden was empty now, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze, but I could still picture him there, Austin, his sun-kissed skin glistening with sweat, his hands moving with purpose and care. The memory of him stirred something deep within me, something I hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't just physical. It was the way he looked at me, like I was someone worth seeing, like I was someone worth wanting. The guilt gnawed at me, but so did the longing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between two lives, one safe and predictable, the other uncertain and exhilarating. I didn't sleep that night. Julian's breathing beside me was steady, but my mind was chaos. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, I slipped out of bed, dressing quietly and heading downstairs. The garden called to me, and I answered. Austin was already there when I stepped outside, his back to me as he knelt in the soil. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I just watched him, my breath catching in my chest. Good morning, I finally said, my voice soft but steady. He turned, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, charged with everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't done. Morning, he replied, his voice low. He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, and took a step toward me. I wasn't sure I'd see you again. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, my gaze dropping to the ground. But here I am. He was quiet for a moment, and when I looked up, I saw the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict I felt in my own heart. Sophia, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't want to hurt you. Or him. The sincerity in his words cut through me. You haven't, I said, my voice trembling. You've made me feel alive again. Austin, and I don't know what to do with that. He took another step closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch me, but he stopped himself. I don't know either, he admitted, but I know I can't just walk away. The honesty in his words broke something open in me. Neither can I whispered. We stood there, the space between us shrinking with every breath. And then, without thinking, I reached for him, my fingers brushing against his arm. The contact was electric, and I felt him stiffen for a moment before he leaned into it. Sophia, he said again, his voice strained. This isn't easy. I know, I replied, my hand sliding down to his. But I don't want easy. I want real. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he might pull away again. But then his fingers twined with mine, and he stepped closer until I could feel the warmth of his body against mine. This is real, he whispered, his free hand cupping my cheek. But it's complicated. It is, I agreed, my heart pounding in my chest. But I'm tired of pretending, Austin. Tired of denying what I feel. His thumb traced a line along my jaw, and I shivered at the touch. Me too, he admitted. But I can't promise you anything. I don't know how this ends. Neither do I said, my voice barely audible. But I want to find out. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine for something reassurance, maybe, or permission. And then, slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative at first, but quickly deepened, as if we were both trying to pour all of our unspoken feelings into it. When he finally pulled away, I was breathless, my heart racing. We can't keep doing this, he said, though his voice was thick with reluctance. I know, I replied, my fingers tightening around his. But I don't know how to stop. He sighed, resting his forehead against mine. Neither do I. We stayed like that for a moment, our breaths mingling, before he stepped back, releasing my hand. I should get back to work, he said, though his eyes were still on mine. I nodded, though every fiber of my being wanted to pull him back to me. I'll see you around, I said, the words feeling inadequate. Yeah, he replied, his voice soft. See you around. I watched him walk away, my heart aching with the weight of everything we hadn't said. And as I turned back toward the house, I realized that I wasn't just teetering on the edge anymore, I was falling. The days after that moment in the garden blurred together, each one a delicate dance of stolen glances and unspoken words. Julian was home now, his presence felt more as a shadow than a companion. He was there, but not really there. His mind was always elsewhere, on his work, his phone, his next trip. I tried to engage him, to bridge the widening gap between us, but my attempts felt hollow, like I was speaking into a void. And then there was Austin. I found myself lingering in the garden more often, under the pretense of admiring the blooming roses or the freshly trimmed hedges. But the truth was, I was there for him. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in even when I told myself to stay away. He worked with the same quiet confidence, his sun-kissed face glowing under the afternoon sun. Every time our eyes met, my stomach tightened with a mix of longing and guilt. One afternoon, I couldn't resist any longer. I walked over to where he was kneeling by the flower beds, his hands deep in the soil. Need any help? I asked, my voice light, though my heart was pounding. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face before it melted into a smile. You don't have to get your hands dirty, he said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. I don't mind, I replied, kneeling beside him. The earth was warm and soft beneath my fingers, grounding me in the moment. For a while, we worked in silence, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. But the air between us was heavy, charged with something neither of us dared to name. Sophia, he said finally, his voice low and tentative. I turned to look at him, and his gaze locked onto mine. There was something raw in his eyes, a vulnerability that made my breath catch. Yes, I prompted, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of a flower petal. I can't stop thinking about that kiss, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. My chest tightened, and I felt a rush of heat flood my cheeks. Neither can I confessed, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He leaned in slightly, his eyes searching mine. Is this really what you want? I swallowed hard, the weight of his question pressing down on me. It was what I wanted. I wanted him, wanted this connection that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But it wasn't that simple. There was Julian. There was the life we'd built together. There was the world outside that would judge us, condemn us. I don't know, I whispered, my voice trembling. But I can't pretend this isn't real. His hand found mine, his touch sending shivers up my arm. Then maybe we don't have to pretend, he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of everything we were risking. But in that moment, I didn't care. I leaned in, closing the distance between us, and our lips met in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. It was like coming home after a long journey, like finding something I didn't even know I'd lost. When we finally pulled away, I felt breathless, my head spinning with the intensity of it all. This is dangerous, I murmured, resting my forehead against his. I know, he replied, his voice soft but resolute. But sometimes the best things are. We stayed like that for a while, our hands intertwined, our breaths mingling. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us in this fragile bubble of intimacy. But eventually, reality crept back in. I should go, he said reluctantly, pulling away. Before someone sees us. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to beg him to stay. Be careful, I said, my voice tinged with both worry and affection. He gave me a small smile, his eyes warm with unspoken promises. You too. As I watched him walk away, my heart ached with the weight of everything we were risking. But for the first time in years, I felt alive. Later that evening, as I sat across from Julian at the dinner table, I found it hard to meet his eyes. He was talking about his next business trip, his voice monotone and distant. I nodded along, but my mind was elsewhere, on Austin, on the way his touch made me feel, on the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Sophia, Julian said, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Are you even listening?" I forced a smile, though it felt strained. "Of course," I said, though I couldn't remember a single word he'd just said. He gave me a skeptical look but didn't press further. The silence between us was deafening, a stark contrast to the warmth and connection I felt with Austin. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Julian, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, torn between the life I had and the life I wanted. I turned to look at him, his face calm in the soft glow of the moonlight. I wanted to say something, to bridge the gap between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I slipped out of bed and made my way to the garden. The night air was cool against my skin, a welcome relief from the turmoil inside me. I sat on the bench, staring up at the stars, and let myself dream of what could be. A rustling sound caught my attention, and I turned to see Austin standing there, his face shadowed, but his eyes bright. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. I shook my head, my heart swelling at the sight of him. "No," I admitted. He walked over and sat beside me, his warmth a comforting presence. "Me neither," he said, his voice tinged with a nervous energy. We sat in silence for a while, the night wrapping around us like a blanket. Finally, he spoke again. "What are we doing, Sophia?" I turned to look at him, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "I don't know," I confessed, "but I don't want to stop." He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. "Neither do I," he said. His voice filled with a quiet determination. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt a surge of courage. I leaned in, my lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both tender and electric. He responded instantly, his hands cupping my face as he deepened the kiss. When we finally pulled away, I felt breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "We're playing with fire," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Then let's burn," he replied, his eyes blazing with the intensity that made my stomach flip. I hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. But before I could respond, he pulled me in again, his lips crashing against mine in a kiss that felt like